going on. It's like I want to talk about the spirit that I've seen and different examples of it, but it's the spirit of isolation. Uh, there's many examples out in history when how isolation has plays tricks on the mind. Because I mean I can understand where this comes from because isolation you become you think a lot in order to compensate for the lack of conversation or stimulation. Um, you start to you start to think of things in your head, and a lot of this stuff is based off of imaginations, and you can kind of like tune that thing up like really good to where it's prone to kind of like jump the gun. It's like, look, at night, the reason why you'll see a shadow and think it's a silhouette of a person is because the lack of vision makes everything kind of blend together, and the pareidolia effect kicks in, where you see all these scarecrows basically. Some, one out of 100 scarecrows will actually be, well, look, that was a real cat inside that shadow. For instance, or something spooky, something to startle you. But a lot of times it's your own mind that's freaking like really. Plus, because the environment, that's kind of how isolation freaking kind of works as well. Freaking there's accounts of these monks that would go and stay in the mountains, and they said it was a very difficult thing because of these guys' intense isolation. They'd have to send people to check on them every now and then to make sure that they didn't die or go insane. Uh, and because these guys would start talking to ghosts, you know what I'm saying? And it's from the isolation. Look, you can also, if you want to see a real quick example of the spirit of isolation, you go look at someone in solitary confinement in prison, and they get really violent, and they get highly paranoid, and they get really delusional. And it's not that they're delusional, it's that anyone who's isolated for long enough cracks and starts to talk to the ghosts. You know what I'm saying? And in order to pass the time, yeah, they're you're gonna elaborate. It's, man, this is called something else too, man. Sleep deprivation is kind of simulator because they got you. It's kind of similar because they got you isolated in this area and the conditions controlled, and it's long and repetitious. And when you're isolated, the time warps to where like hours seem like minutes, but then minutes can seem like days, and you just lose all sense of time. And for some reason, it forces the brain to it kind of the the active part of your brain kind of starts to go to sleep, and then the automatic autopilot of your brain kind of kicks in. And
theta waves, the alpha waves are the ones that you go into,
yeah,
where you're capable to, you leave beta to alpha, so you're capable of sponge like
yeah,
learning.
I understand what you're saying too, but so look, the isolation can induce spiritual things to where, look, people are talking to ghosts, they're talking to spirits, whether it's a demon posing as a spirit, or if it's in like a ghost, like say someone died, was murdered in the land, and then they haunt the land. I'm not sure how the whole thing works, but or if it's just figments of the person's imagination. uh, who knows, or if it's just a memory from his childhood he forgot and it's repressed. But when the active part of the brain goes to bed and the automatic comes out, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like it's compartmental. It is in some cases anyway, but you know what I'm saying? This isolation makes people really freaking paranoid. Let me think of an example of that. There's this guy named an Indian guy. Like basically, this movie Last of the Dogmen is based on a guy like this character, this Yishi guy, and he would sneak around for years and years and years, and he was the last member of his tribe, and they for their whole life trained to avoid everyone. And this guy was so used to doing it that he for most of his life he lived out there just creeping around, you know, staying unseen, and then finally he was apprehended, captured, and then they basically studied him like a freaking guinea pig. You know, and this isolation thing also, it's like in prison you see people get hyper vigilant and hyper aggressive, and they're hypersensitive to disrespect. And this is another form of isolation, because even though they're in the regular pop or whatever in prison, they're still isolated from real society. And even real society is just a freaking matrix. So that's why some guys in prison can make it. They can go into the mind, and it's not the isolation guy who's fucking manufacturing. Like, he's disassociated, and the trauma and the PTSD is so bad that he has to construct an artificial reality. And that self-defense mechanism is kind of like that movie where the kids were making mean faces, and they were like, one day you're going to make that face and it's going to get stuck like that. And then someone slapped them on the back and their face got stuck like that. It's kind of like that, man. Sometimes that's how these things happen. They don't happen like right away. It's kind of incremental. You know what I mean? So it's like if you practice it too much, you could get stuck like that for a time, or forever potentially. And they say that's why not everyone does that freaking go alone in the mountains training, because not everyone freaking makes it, because they break. So segregation is not quite isolation, but it's similar. You know what I'm saying? The isolation makes you really suspicious of people and freaking paranoid. So it's like, it's not good that people should be alone too much. There are certain types of people where they require periods of loneliness, but no, there's a point where you can be comfortable with yourself and you can be alone for a decent amount of time, and you won't be messed up about it. You won't lose touch with relationships with people in your life. They'll just like kind of be a little different, but like, look, it's not like you forget the past, or you can't remember the things you used to laugh about, jokes, stuff like that. The person stuff, it don't go away. You know what I'm saying? But for some people it might. You know, I never went in the mountains for 10 years and lived alone. You know, there's a lot of just times in the Bible where certain people isolated. Freaking Ezra, in Second Ezra, it's a story about him isolating a lot. And while he's isolated, he keeps catching visions. Once again, you know what I'm saying? And so Elijah was isolating in the cave. I think David isolated in the cave. Christ went to isolate in the wilderness for a certain period of time. But there's a lot of instances of short durations of isolation. That's nothing. This is different from long period of isolation, forced isolation. Look, or what's the word I'm looking for? Preferred isolation. Okay, it's like there's detrimental kind of isolation, but there's a hermit kind of isolation that's kind of more like mountain men. They were isolated. They still traded. They still worked. They just were isolated a lot. You know what I'm saying? So, of course, it's going to be different. Freaking a person who, by necessity, has to isolate, but yet it's beneficial, it's profitable. The guy becomes way self-reliant, self-sufficient. You know what I'm saying? But, you know, when you isolate a man into the prison system, it's like he's not self-sufficient. It's totally manufactured and like totally controlled conditions. You know what I'm saying? The opposite of mountain man, which most of these conditions are out of my control. I just got to roll with them, and you know what I'm saying. But the spirit of isolation can happen in groups. I read stories of Indian And in the Indian stories, where they weren't even about Indians, they were about the traders, which not like we we sold them out traders, but we sell goods traders. This one trader had like a half breed Indian wife or something like that, and he left this servant with his wife to help tend to the cabin while he went to Montreal or Quebec or something. And in the isolation, the helper got a crush on the wife, and then made up a whole like insane kind of I know you love me and I love you type of thing, but there wasn't really nothing going on. For with the woman, it was like totally the guy sirened himself, self sabotage, fulfilling uh, false prophecy type of a deal. And the guy killed the woman and buried her body. And then in the spring, no, he was trying to run away to Canada. But the Indians would say a more scary story where they say the man was cursed and he kept trying to get away, but the ice would break and he'd have to go home. And he almost died freezing from the water. And then 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 in the spring when the husband came back, he found out that the wife was gone. So they brought the authorities of the time, which is basically like a lynch party, but so the good old boys come over. They brought the hounds. A man stuck a cane with a knife on it in the corner and pulled it up, and there was a wretched stink on it, and they found the woman's body. And supposedly, there's multiple accounts of what happened to this guy. Uh, they're all bad. Like, one said he was took to Quebec and was hung. The other said he was on his way to Quebec and he got free, or he was let free by someone, and then he had to become a vagabond, and he ended up with a different tribe of Indians. And after he was like Dances with Wolves, but one day they were talking about their deeds that they done, and then this man confessed his act of cowardice and murder and betrayal, and the Indians freaking looked at him all, and then they freaking smoked him, and then they were like, this man was worse than a bad dog. You know what I'm saying, in a way. So there's another form of this isolation thing, like people stranded on islands, man. So they might have imaginary friends. And here's another thing, like being the boss. Okay, everyone's out to get me and take my spot. He's amongst all these people, but you feel totally alone. Same thing like when you start to learn things and you have no one to talk to about it with, no one to share in it with, no one to fellowship with about it. You get lonely, even though you're amongst all these people, but no one has no common ground with you, so you still feel kind of the isolation. No,